as the coronavirus pandemic continues to rage on across the world. Hopes for a V-shaped economic recovery have largely been dashed as unemployment continues and second waves surge in countries that initially flattened the curve. Economies saw record plunges in GDP growth during the second quarter, causing many to wonder if the worst is yet to come. To talk about the outlook for the rest of 2020, we're joined by Nikolai Rusinov, Professor of Finance at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us all the way from Philadelphia.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And we also have Dr. Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. It's great to see you again.
Happy to be here.
Well, let's start with you, Dr. Rusinov. For several months, countries around the world have been experimenting with lockdowns, and no one seems to be able to agree when the right time is to actually ease restrictions. And we've seen economies faring a bit better after lockdowns were loosened, but are these slight rebounds meaningful when second and even third waves just keep coming?
Right. Well, in general, this is a very hard problem, of course, and a hard problem because ultimately the length of lockdowns depends on how people behave after the lockdown ends, and sometimes even before lockdown is put in place. And ultimately, we don't know how quickly the virus propagates until we have tests, until we have observations of infected people. And the goal is to keep the reproduction number below 1. And of course, when we can observe it with some lag. When people think that we've somehow conquered the virus and lockdowns have been eased, if they get too optimistic and don't maintain social distancing, don't wear masks, and so on and so forth, go to bars and clubs, then inevitably this reproduction number is going to go up and possibly causing new lockdowns reimposed. And I think this is what we've seen in some areas in the United States, where after fairly successful flattening of the curve, in the spring we've seen big flare-ups and then subsequently reimposed lockdowns in places like California in particular.
Well, we're definitely seeing that here in South Korea as well, where authorities are considering the highest level of social distancing measures as infections are they're resurfacing now. And Dr. Yang, so the same question really goes to you. Is there any point to easing lockdowns only to see infections surge?
Well, I think if you only look at the GDP, you're looking at it from a very short-term point of view. Now, it is true that the countries which went off lockdown early or did not go lockdown at all, they do tend to have a slightly higher second quarter growth rates. That's partially because, well, in a lot of countries in Europe and United States, because of the shutdown and the lockdown, they just stopped producing, but that was done deliberately to stop the contagion. But if you look at perhaps average growth for not only the second quarter, but this year and next year or even year after, it might be that the countries which have lockdown and shutdowns will have higher growth rate overall. And that's because if you have a lockdown or a shutdown, you can control the spread of the virus. Now, even Korea's highest level, third level distancing measure, it's not completely a shutdown or a lockdown. You can still have small meetings, factories still keep running, but if you cannot control the COVID and these infections spread to, say, Samsung semiconductor factory, you're going to see a major problem in production. So I think at least most of the academic economists agree that you need to get coronavirus under control first, and there really isn't a trade-off between controlling the coronavirus through lockdown and shutdown or higher levels of social distancing necessary, if necessary, and growth in the medium term.
Right, so it's not the immediate figures that we should look at, but rather the long haul, really. And Dr. Yang, there has been some doubt over whether GDP accurately indicates, well, socioeconomic development or progress, especially amid this COVID-19 pandemic. So do you think GDP is actually an indicator that we should be going by, or does it fail to address some aspects?
Well, GDP is a measure of how much you produce, and because of the characteristics of the GDP, it also represents the total amount of expenditure by domestic and foreign agents like government, consumers, firms, and it also represents total income in terms of money and material, but it doesn't particularly represent health and happiness overall. So it's part of the picture, but it's not all of the picture. And as I mentioned before, the problem is if you're so afraid of trade-off that you do not go into a higher level social distancing when it is necessary and the disease spreads, then in the long term, as the virus becomes more spread throughout the production facilities or families, home care centers for the older people, you're going to have much bigger hit on the economy than if you just went with the increased, strengthened lockdown or distancing in the first place.
Well, that's something that the South Korean health authorities really need to hear at this point, I believe. And, well, Dr. Rusanov, the US economy contracted by 10.6% during the first half of 2020, and that marked the biggest and the fastest decline since the Great Depression. And, of course, unemployment soared as high as 14.7% in May, with more than 22 million jobs lost. And it seems now that hopes of a V-shaped recovery are now largely dashed for this year. So when do you think a recovery will actually come about?
Right. So the V-shaped recovery, I think, was always kind of an illusion or an illusion of a hope that I don't think many people actually had, because there's no way to have a V-shaped recovery unless the virus is completely conquered. Basically, we would have an effective and readily available vaccine for everyone. And until that is the fact of life, there is no hope of a full 100% recovery. When to expect that, I think, is anyone's guess, and I have no kind of expert knowledge on when to expect that. I think many experts expect something by the end of the year, but we don't really know. There's, I think, a lot of uncertainty around this, and I think, again, until that kind of the fundamental solution to the virus is brought about, we're not going to have anything like a full recovery. So people talk these days of a Nike swoosh-shaped recovery rather than anything resembling a V, meaning there was a little bit of a recovery early on, certainly in the U.S. About half of the loss from the first quarter was recovered in the second quarter as lockdowns were eased, but now things have kind of flattened out, and in certain areas, in fact, have gotten worse. So employment has improved, and employment went down to just over 10% in July. But in the recent numbers, we've seen a rise in initial unemployment claims in particular. So we're nowhere near full recovery, and I don't think we have any hope of it until perhaps the end of the year. And then it all depends on the success of a vaccine, or maybe at least widespread and cheap enough testing that the contagious people can be easily isolated. But again, I don't have much of a hope of that anytime soon.
Well, some businesses that traditionally took up much of the economy, Dr. Rusanov, such as airlines or manufacturing, they've been affected, they've been the worst hit by this pandemic. But some businesses, some sectors such as IT have been doing rather well amid this pandemic. And well, how do you think the industrial landscape is going to change as a result of COVID-19?
This is a very good question. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty about it. But certainly if we look at, let's say, the financial markets, right, the high-tech companies have been leading the recovery in the stock market. A lot of them were barely even affected by the big sell-offs in March. And in the stock market overall has been near its highs, and the tech names, of course, have been rallying way beyond to kind of unprecedented, really, valuations, in part because the tech sector is seen as a kind of a safe haven if the virus is not conquered in the near term. We're all using technology now for things that we used to do in person instead of going to meetings and traveling. We're here on Zoom and Skype and so on and so forth. And I think this will affect the industrial landscape, as you said, in the long run, as well as we will realize that a lot of the jobs that the economy had before the virus that were lost will probably not come back. Now, this is something to have seen in the past 3 recessions as well, and even though those recessions were caused by very different shocks and forces, the common element that has been observed is the polarization of the job market, and the jobs that had disappeared in those recessions didn't generally reappear in the industries where those jobs were primarily kind of low skilled and low paid, because in large part they were replaced by technology, automation, robotization, and these days we're talking about even artificial intelligence taking over some of the jobs that we had previously thought were very safe. I think this is another instance where we'll see that some of the jobs that have disappeared will be replaced by some combination of technology and, of course, human jobs. If we think about, let's say, grocery delivery, has been a booming business. Of course, it relies on the drivers delivering our food, but the employment is nowhere comparable to what the employment of a regular retail food business would be like. So I think what we're expecting to see is an even further accelerated shift towards automation, kind of technology and information technology driven manufacturing, as well as these other industries that previously were kind of thought to be relatively safe from being automated away, such as leisure and hospitality and travel. These are the industries that are most affected by the coronavirus pandemic. And I think even though they will ultimately come back to a large extent, they might not come back fully, as things like business travel might be curtailed for some time to come, as many of us get used to meetings via Zoom, decide that it's probably not necessary to get on the plane for, let's say, a 2-hour conversation with somebody. And this is going to dent the employment in industries like airlines, taxi business, and hotels, and so on.
Right, and we're really going to have to prepare for the impact of these changes, especially digitalization. Well, Dr. Yang, here in South Korea, the economy saw its worst contraction since the first quarter of 1998, meaning that we are technically in a recession, and exports have plunged to their lowest value since 1963. But at the same time, government and private spending have both increased as authorities gave emergency handouts and all sorts of incentives for people to spend. Are these kind of measures, though, sustainable in the long haul? And what is your forecast for the second half of this year for the South Korean economy?
Okay, well, you can say that it's not sustainable, but I think we really don't have a choice at the moment. We have to rely on increased government expenditure to try to get us through this. Otherwise, if the firms start failing, then even if there is a COVID vaccine, you're not going to have a rapid recovery. You might not even have a full recovery at all because, well, if the firms are still alive, they can start hiring people again. But if firms are dead, then you need to wait until the firms start reviving again, and that might take years. So we really don't have a choice but to rely on government expenditure, but we should be doing it more wisely. We did give emergency relief to everybody, and I think that was somewhat of a wrong decision. They should have concentrated on people who are directly impacted by the coronavirus or the poorer segment of the population. Because, well, the whole idea of giving people emergency relief is that they spend the money so that the firms remain alive. But according to Vice Prime Minister Hong Nam-gi, only about a third of the money was actually spent. And we don't have the income profile of people who spent the money and how much. But studies coming out of the United States seem to indicate that, as expected, the poorer people spent more of the money, while the richer people did not spend that much of the money. So this time around, if we are going to have an emergency relief, we should really target it toward the lower income or people who were directly affected. That would be a much more wiser way of spending the money. And then after COVID, Korea should seriously consider raising productivity because, well, Korea, according to the latest OECD report, we've known this, Korea has fairly low productivity. And I think we're not going to be able to reduce government expenditure by much because of Korea's aging demographic. So the only choice we have is to try to lower the debt to GDP ratio by increasing the GDP. And that requires massive structural changes as well as changes which increase Korea's productivity, like making the labor market more flexible and reducing the market regulations, because Korea also has a very high levels of market restrictions, and try to make Korea just more productive so that we can increase the GDP faster than the deficit.
Really, this is something that the government is going to have to work on right now. It's a very big problem that's right around the corner as well. Before we go, Dr. Rusanov, how should governments create new jobs, and how should the workforce really adapt to the new normal as we try to recover from this economic crisis?
I don't think there's much the governments can do to literally create jobs, but I think they can potentially help people acquire the skills that they will need to kind of adapt to a new economic landscape. I think efforts to ultimately improve education and retraining and helping acquire the skills of the new economy, now that many people who are kind of sitting at home, not by sort of their own choice, but because the jobs are not there, their employers have furloughed them or have shut down. Maybe encourage these workers to acquire skills that they can, using whatever technology that is available to them, and maybe even tie some of the extra unemployment benefits that are being handed out to some efforts at acquiring these new skills that will make these workers potentially more adapted to the new kind of post-COVID economy.
Right, so in the meantime, while we are under lockdown and we can't do much about the economy just now, perhaps they can really retrain in new skills, and the government needs to work on very long-term measures that we are going to need in the long haul. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up the discussion here today, but that was Dr. Nikolai Rusanov, Professor of Finance at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and Dr. Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Thank you both so much for joining the programme.
Thank you so much.
And to our viewers, thank you very much for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with expert analysis on how COVID-19 is affecting our mental health. So don't miss that, and have a good one wherever you are. Goodbye.